Thank you, Sunain. Thank you, Arvind. Thank you, Sunaina. I actually want to begin by thanking both of you and your colleagues for the really outstanding work you're doing. Equity in public education is a much needed intervention. In my mind, it fills a long-standing gap in our public discourse as a prelude to this morning's conversation. I'd like this to be a conversation and a dialogue more than a lecture. Certainly, I'll try and keep my remarks really brief. I went back and looked at my own alumni directory at Princeton's public policy school. And what I did was to try and scrape all Indian sounding names. This is what happens when a chemical engineer who can do a little bit of coding goes into problems of this sort. So my own guess is in the last 30 years for which I could access the data, I think Princeton has digitized this data for only last 30 years or so. Of the students who seem to be Indian origin, from what I can tell, there isn't a single, and when I say a single, at least rough eyeballing, there isn't a single Bahujan student who has passed through the portals of Princeton's public policy school. I could be wrong on a couple of names. I haven't done this rigorously enough, so I'm not going to go to town with this number, but really close to 0%, right? So it's essentially been people like me with enormous caste class privilege that have benefited from. I mean, one must understand that what EPE is trying to do is really get the diversity records at these institutions straightened out, right? I mean, in my own case, I was able to attend Princeton because Princeton wanted a brown-skinned person in their classroom. I mean, I added that diversity. Did I really represent diverse India? That's a question I think we should all ask ourselves, and that's the question that EPE is asking. Thanks, Arvind, for this opportunity. In his announcement, Arvind most generously described me as a social activist. I immediately experienced an acute imposter syndrome, right, from which I'm yet to fully recover. Thankfully, that email went to my spam folder, so I didn't discover Arvind's announcement after he made the announcement. I cannot possibly be a social activist, certainly not in the spaces that equity in policy education operates. That would be an insult to brave women and men who are not for activists like me. However, upon further reflection, I took Arvind's byline to be an invitation to interrogate my own privilege. 100 years ago, in the interwar period in the 1920s and the 1930s, it was not uncommon for Indians like me with enormous caste and class privilege to ask, what are the sources of my privilege? What should I do with it? I believe these questions are no longer asked seriously, at least not often enough. And even when what should I do with my privilege question is asked, the what are the sources of my privilege question is skirted at best and often answered in very self-serving ways. Groups like Equity in Policy Education are vital because you illuminate how the real problem is the hierarchical structure and not an individual station on that totem. Thus, I will mostly don my admittedly imposter activist hat, given that Arvind has handed me one. I'll wear that, even though it's an imposter hat, rather than my academic hat in making my remarks this morning. I'll keep it short so that we can have a conversation and hopefully even a genuine dialogue. I mean, I see a lot of young people in the audience, and it'd be good to actually have a conversation rather than a monologue. Professors are, of course, always very, very podium hungry, right? I mean, we can go on and on. So, Arvind or Sunaina, you should shut me down. We probably have an hour, so in 25 minutes or so, shut me down, and we should start having a conversation. Let me begin. Oops. Okay, let me begin with this now famous or infamous, if you will, picture of the former American Vice President, Mike Pence, meeting with the so-called Freedom Caucus members of his party. This was a meeting to discuss cuts to, among other things, maternity benefits. You don't have to be a card-carrying member of Equity in Public Policy Education or any other anti-caste or any such group to feel somewhat uncomfortable, perhaps even squeamish about what is happening here, right? A bunch of white men gathered around the table discussing policy measures. The central question for that morning was reproductive rights and maternity benefits for women. Right? I mean, you immediately recognize there is something problematic here. I mean, you can't possibly have a group of men sitting around the table deciding what to do with women's reproductive rights or maternity care. I started with this picture because I want to follow this up with a question. Why don't we feel equally squeamish, or at least partly uncomfortable, with a setting that does not look very different in discussing a variety of policy questions of immediate, even urgent importance? I mean, let me cite from a work that I'm doing with a young colleague here. We've been looking at the most recent 2022 summer Indian heat wave and what it did to people around the country. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody in this group that heat waves disproportionately impact Bahujans. Right? I mean, Indian caste system, after all, is division of laborers. Right? It's more than division of labor, as Ambedkar famously observed. It's division of laborers, and who are the people actually working outside in heat wave conditions? It's the Bahujans, right? And I can actually give you some numbers on these. Right? By a very, very conservative estimate, the lower bound estimate is that for every hour that a Bahujan works outside in the sun, controlling for her income, gender, everything else that you want to control for, is about 35% more likely to be exposed to harmful heat exposure dose. I mean, I'm not going to get into the technical details of how you want to calculate environmental stress index, so on and so forth. But for the technically minded amongst you, the work hour elasticity of exposure is 35%, at least 35% more for OBC and SC group workers. And this is from a very large nationally representative labor force survey that we combined with very, very high resolution satellite data to try and figure out how heat waves differentially impact sections of Indian society and what does thermal injustice actually look like. Now, juxtapose this fact that OBC and SC workers are 35% face a 35% greater elasticity of exposure with the fact that of the 7 heat plan committees that I know of in India, high-level policy committee formed to actually tackle heat waves, there isn't a single Bahujan on those committees. Right? I mean, so this is a problem that is now here, current, and that's the problem that a group like EPE is trying to address. Right? And it's a very, very hard problem. I mean, indeed, I stick my neck out and say that if only caste had a phenotype characteristic like gender or race, something that you could immediately recognize, then our picture of a meeting of the sort that you see on your screen would be even more monochromatic, right? I mean, to give you some numbers, and I'll get to this in just a little bit. Uh, the composition of the social composition of faculty body at elite public institutions such as IIMs and IITs in 2022 is more monochromatic than University of Cape Town in 2002, 20 years ago, right? And that's the problem that a group like EPE is trying to address. It's very important to recognize that even while EPE is working with global institutions based in Europe, US, etc., we are actually looking at a South African kind of apartheid problem. It's a majority exclusion problem and not a minority inclusion problem. The minority inclusion problem is important. The kind of problems that American institutions are used to dealing with, or at least have been used to dealing with in the last couple of decades, is important. I mean, no taking away from the fact that racial justice is important, questions of race are important, so on and so forth. But the problem here is more akin to what South Africans have tried to grapple with, rather than what Americans are grappling with. What you're essentially positing is that about 80% of India does not have a seat on the policy table. And that's very bluntly put, that's the problem that a group like EPE is confronting, right? And that's why the small, seemingly baby steps that a group like EPE is undertaking is so important. I mean, one simply cannot overstate what Arvind and Sunaina and others are doing. It's not just policy, cognate fields. I mean, just to give you a sense that that picture wasn't entirely unrelated to what we are talking about this morning. This is from the famous Oxfam report that came out last year, talking about how our newsrooms are dominated by upper caste journalists. Out of that report, what I've done is plucked out just one table. This is the social identity of writers on caste issues, and even actually caste discrimination. I mean, these are articles in these various leading English language newspapers in India talking about caste and caste discrimination. And even on these questions, the bylines are dominated by upper caste columnists and journalists. Right. So there is a structural problem here where institutions that produce culture, and I don't want to get into. For now, I'll keep culture within quotation marks. Are simply elite culture is just completely dominated by traditional elites, right? And from my own vantage point, this data is just pre-pandemic. There was a major quote-unquote special recruitment drive that happened over the last 2 years, so the numbers have slightly improved. But nonetheless, even if I actually ran this latest data, I don't have the slides. I'm not quite ready to go to town with that data because that's not administrative data obtained under RTI. We should have that data pretty soon. This is faculty composition at various Indian institutes of management, including my own. And then I can go ad nauseum with where this comes from, why one should care about this, so on and so forth. but the data is simply incontrovertible, right? I mean, any which way you slice this problem, and with a very generous margin of error, data is just too stark. This cannot be legitimate in any society, right? And that's really what a group like EPE is shining the light on. Okay, so now I want to change track. I mean, given this is the problem, how did we get here? What have we done in the last 75 years? And I think a useful place to begin is by looking at the foundational document, right? I mean, India is actually unique. I mean, we often forget that the first objective of the republic coming together is social justice, right? So we, the people of India, come together as this republic to secure for all its citizens justice, three kinds of justice. But the primary objective, at least the primary normative objective of the Indian republic, I mean, it's especially in times like these, it's very, very important to keep hammering about what the normative benchmarks are. I mean, even as we might have moved very far away from what those normative benchmarks are, the primary normative objective is secure social justice, right? And to fully understand what this means, I'd want to draw your attention to what is probably one of the most important speeches delivered by a founder of our republic, the speech that Dr. Ambedkar delivered on November 25th, 1949, must be familiar to a lot of you in the Constituent Assembly just before the Indian Constitution was adopted the next day, right? Where he makes this distinction between political democracy and social democracy. In fact, it's actually useful to go back to the original and sort of see where so much of the numbers that we looked at actually come from. So I'm going to quote. This is Dr. Ambedkar speaking on November 25th, 1949. We must make our political democracy a social democracy as well. I mean, that, of course, is the first objective of the Indian Republic. Political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of it social democracy. What does social democracy mean? It means a way of life which recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity as the principles of life. The principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity are not to be treated as separate items in a trinity. And to my mind, the most important line from this stirring speech is this one. They form a union of trinity in the sense that to diverse one from the other is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. Liberty cannot be diverse from equality. Equality cannot be diverse from liberty. Nor can liberty and equality be diverse from fraternity. While scholars have spent a lot of time interrogating the relationship between liberty and equality, we haven't paid as much attention to questions of fraternity. Right? I mean, and fraternity is, by all accounts, somewhat of an alien concept to Indians. Right? I mean, it was, well, it's part of our constitution, but our Indian social order is anything but fraternal, right? And this is at the heart of why we see the kind of outcomes that we see. And I mean, I actually urge you to go and read the speech in its entirety. Every public policy scholar from India ought to be able to recite the speech backwards from memory, because it's so foundational to everything that groups like EPE are doing. Let me give you a sense of why we are not a fraternal society at all from some of my own work with collaborators around the world. This is a textbook representation of the Indian village. This is Amin Bhavi in Dharwad district of Karnataka from circa 1950, made very, very famous because it now dons every single introductory Indian sociology book. This is how village India is organized, right? I mean, obviously the terminology comes from 1950, so you see Dalits living at the edge of the village, the dominant landholding caste at the center of the village. This is pretty much how rural India is organized across the country. I mean, I could give you examples from many different parts of the country. So where is fraternity? There is absolutely no fraternity in this picture, right? I mean, there is spatial segregation. Spatial segregation is also segregation of other sorts. I mean, in fact, one of the points that I'll make as I wrap this up is spatial segregation cannot be diverse from cognitive segregation, right? I mean, when it's a problem when 8% of Indian society is deciding for rest of the country, because there's also a cognitive disconnect. And that cognitive disconnect is not unrelated to the fact that you've largely grown in isolated ghettos. I mean, one needs to internalize the fact that ghettos and enclaves are really two sides of the same coin. Right? When we talk about Dalit ghettos, we talk about Muslim ghettos, but the obverse of that is every upper caste person in this country has also grown up in a ghetto. Right? I'll actually show you data on how a typical upper caste child growing up in even a large urban agglomeration like Bangalore really does not cross paths with somebody that does not look like her or him. I'll actually show you some data. This is not just 1950. For the first time, we analyzed very detailed data from over 6 million people in Karnataka, where we actually asked the question, who is your neighbor to all 6 million residents in Karnataka. And what this map shows you is for rural Karnataka, all the holes that you see are urban centers that have been poked out. I'll deal with urban Karnataka separately. Very similar high levels of segregation. I want you to especially focus on the picture on your right. That's the spatial segregation between Dalits and others, right? So rural Karnataka today continues to look like what it has looked for eons. I mean, indeed, for groups like EPE, we've even compared these numbers with antebellum American South. The degree of segregation in rural India today is actually higher than it was on the eve of civil war in the American South. Right. So we need to understand where the structural drivers are coming from. Right. I mean, if you see that 90% of IIM faculty members are drawn from less than 6% of India's social groups, that happens because this is a very, very stable hierarchy, and hierarchy that has lasted at least a couple of millennia. And then that's what people like EPE are up against. This is a very famous photograph from Bombay. This is what it looks like. in an Indian context, uh, the two parts of the photos is not simply division of labor, right? It is actual also division of laborers. And I mean, that's the important point that we need to internalize when we think through why uh, structures of exclusion are important when we think through policy scholarship. Not just any city. Let me just quickly jump to Calcutta, right? I mean, Calcutta is seen as the city that's progressive, where caste seems to be history. Focus on the red line. I mean, I'm not going to, for the uninitiated, I'm not going to go into the technicalities of how a Lorentz curve is drawn and so on and so forth. What this red curve simply shows is in 60% of Calcutta's neighborhoods in 2011, this is data from 2011 national census, there isn't a single Dalit. Right, so 60% of the neighborhoods in Calcutta, and the neighborhood is a very small unit. I mean, this is your lived experience neighborhood. We are talking about 100 residents, 150 residents. It's just one small street, right? So 60% of what people would consider neighborhoods in Calcutta don't have a single Dalit. Right, so I mean that's how ghettoization works. I mean, I haven't thrown in Muslim segregation here as well. So if you combined religion-based segregation and caste-based segregation, it's a pretty grim picture. So you could be or take Bangalore, from where I'm speaking. About 25% of neighborhoods in Bangalore don't have a single Dalit. Or to put it another way, you can look at the curve from the other end, right? So about 40%, sorry, about 60% of Dalits are confined to roughly 15% of the city. Right, so if you are an upper caste person growing up anywhere else, you're likely not to encounter a Dalit in your life, right? So where is the question of fraternity? I mean, you're not even seeing somebody that does not look like you. So there is no question of fraternity and everything else that is needed to give us liberty and equality. Right. I mean, Ambedkar's 25th November address is so important because it's the first clear statement in independent India about why you cannot have liberty and equality without fraternity. Right? I mean, they come as a package deal. If you wanted liberty and equality, but two values that are very dear to a lot of liberals in India, you have to start with fraternity. Without fraternity, you simply cannot have liberty and equality. Okay, so we extended this analysis beyond the 5 metros. So if you looked at, we looked at every single town in India with at least 3 million people. These are large towns. What this graph simply tells you is the y-axis is some measure of spatial, caste-based spatial segregation. I won't bore you with the details. This simply tells you it doesn't matter where you're living. You might be living in a small town, a big town, Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore. You really experience very similar levels of segregation. There is a difference between rural India and urban India. I mean, when levels of segregation in urban India are slightly lower than in rural India, but nonetheless, the normative promise of India's urbanization, right? I mean, one of the key drivers, normative drivers of Indian urbanization was that urbanization would help us get beyond traditional parochial identities such as caste, creed, so on and so forth, right? Including Ambedkar's own famous observations that uh, villages are but dens of vice and so on and so forth, right? Urbanization simply hasn't done that to India. When identities have been transformed, but not enough, not anywhere enough to give us the kind of fraternity that is needed to say we can actually aspire for true liberty and equality, right? When that simply doesn't exist at all. Uh, Another important data point, this comes from the Indian Human Development Survey, that showed 20% of all urban households, right? So we are not talking about rural households. 20% of all urban households practice at least one form of untouchability, right? In fact, a few years ago, I had a group of my MBA students do a pop, admittedly not very scientific survey on campus. The results were shocking, right? About the same percent, at least a third of all households on an elite campus like IIM practice some form of untouchability. What would officially be termed untouchability? We're not talking about any random caste practice here. We're talking about things that are administratively classified as being a marker of untouchability. Right? That's the level at which we are beginning this conversation. That's the extent of our fraternity. Okay, with that background, I want to very quickly end this by talking about why all of this is particularly important for a policy scholar, right? And I want to do this by using this very famous essay by Andre Bette, distinguishing between common sense ideology and social science. If policy studies is some form of social science, common sense is a collection of empirical facts, not codified using any theoretical apparatus. Can be wrong. After all, there is more than meets an untrained eye. Ideology concerns itself with change and transformation, right? And in fact, in many instances, dissent is suppressed in the interest of this greater good. So common sense and ideology are very different from social science that actually looks for systematic knowledge about society, right? And then this distinction is important because a group like EPE is trying to funnel students into the third bracket, if you will. And similarly, and especially for a policy person, it's important to distinguish between and also understand the relationship between scholarship, research, and action. Scholarship is the acquisition of knowledge, understanding the scaffolding underlying a discipline or multiple disciplines. And scholarship is different from, say, what a craft person does. This is not at all to belittle anything a craft person does. I've written extensively about this. By memorizing only factual knowledge, one can succeed as a craft person, but not as a scholar, as the pioneering economist and ecological economist Judge S.Q. Rogan pointed out. Research involves the application of this scholarship to understand the world around us. Finally, action is an attempt to transform the world around us. Right? And policy scholarship is hard because you're simultaneously trying to do all three. Right? Because you are a scholar when you are trying to master a body of knowledge, you're trying to understand what does the world look like, but you're also actually interested in changing what you don't like. Right? When as a policy scholar, I'm not going to stop at saying, well, this is what residential patterns look like in Bangalore. Right? As a policy scholar, I'm innately interested in questions of so what. Uh, can uh, can that be changed? How might you change that? So on and so forth. Right? Therefore, every policy scholar always is dealing with three very different sets of questions. Right? What is? And then or if you're a historically minded scholar, you could say what was. Uh, Hard sciences have served as a model for validity, rigor, and proof when it comes to what is and what was. But in my mind, that's the actual easy part of a policy scholars' repertoire. And I mean, I mean, there are tools that are out there. You can deploy those tools and ask and answer this question: what is? Once you've done that, you have to move to a slightly harder set of questions. That is, what can be. This is still a technical question, but includes real world institutional constraints. Right? I mean, you're trying to ask the question, given the reality of India's caste structure, how may I do policy A, B, and C? Right? And currently, we don't ask these questions. I mean, for example, the example that I started this conversation with, the most recent heat wave in India. People studying heat waves are not interested in real world constraints. I mean, probably we are not doing enough about heat waves because it affects people that don't look like us, that we don't share residential space with, people that we don't marry into, people that we don't eat with, so on and so forth. I mean, these are constraints that a policy scholar should be aware of, intimately aware of, even, right? Social structures are just really important. We live in a constrained world. But the most important and the most central, and in many ways, really what distinguishes a policy scholar from a mere social scientist is she is also interested in the questions of what should be, right? Policy studies willy-nilly have to look for tools beyond the hard sciences. You have to be looking at normative questions. Even when you are not very explicitly looking at normative questions, you are willy-nilly looking and engaging with normative questions. Not, I mean, every policy conundrum has an irreducible normative component. You simply cannot wish the normative component away if you are a policy scholar, right? So what does a policy scholar do? But what's a good model for a policy scholar? Right? I mean, one way to look at a policy scholar is to say she resembles a clinical physician or a doctor. And the other model is to say the policy scholar is a biochemical scientist working in a lab looking for rigorous validation of hypotheses. Right? I think I mean, I'm going to make an argument that a lot of what groups like EPE are doing is particularly salient and important because the policy scholar is a doctor more than she is a physician. A medical doctor has few theories, but a bag full of carefully honed intuitions. A physician often relies on hypotheses that are only ordinal rather than cardinal. It's often not possible to put most of our real policy conundrums on the number line. Right? I mean, it's very easy to get trapped into. I mean, I'm all for evidence-based policy. I mean, of course, you want to base policy on evidence, but that doesn't fully capture the complexity of why our policy conundrums are often, to use the much abused term, quote unquote, wicked problems. Right? If a policy scholar is a clinical physician rather than a scientist, then the so-called, the very famous Miles law, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, is really, really salient. Where you stand depends on where you sit. right? And this is why, and this comes from, of course, the American bureaucrat Miles, who working in the late 1940s on the American budget, observed that people's policy stances are often contingent on where you sit. I mean, and obviously, you read into this. Where you stand depends on who you are, what your life trajectories have been, so on and so forth. Uh, with at least my tongue firmly in my cheek, we must also, I'm going to suggest, read Miles' law together with, at least in the Indian context, Nash's law, or law within quotes. People who work sitting down, Nash very famously observed, get paid more than people who work standing up. And policy analysis, policy scholarship is of course a bunch of elites who do their work sitting down, but they are doing stuff that disproportionately impacts people who work standing up, right? And that's something to really keep in mind. And nobody in the 20th century understood these conundrums, in my mind at least, better than Gramsci, right? So, and Gramsci conceived of intellectuals, including policy wonks, most broadly as, quote, organizers of culture, stop quote, right? So for Gramsci, intellectuals were basically organizers of culture. His celebrated distinction between traditional and organic intellectuals helps make sense of our own contemporary conundrums. The Gramscian traditional is the professional detached scholar with no apparent allegiance to any specific class. I mean, you can replace class by race, caste, whatever you like, gender, interest, right? So the traditional professional is this detached scholar with no very specific allegiance to particular class, caste, gender, interest. The organic intellectual, on the other hand, is squarely embedded in the predicaments of our own social class or group, and our intellectual work reflects this embeddedness. Right. So that's the distinction. That's the taxonomy that Gramsci introduced: the traditional intellectual versus the organic intellectual. The reason why groups like EPE have come to the fore, I mean, if I now, for the moment, put down my activist hat and wear my social scientist hat, is the enormous success of the recent Black Lives Matter movement. Right? What the Black Lives Matter movement has done is to forcefully bring home the true import of the Gramscian taxonomy. The Black Lives Movement actually showed the Gramscian taxonomy to be somewhat flawed, right? The true import of the Gramscian taxonomy of how intellectuals operate in a society is different from this clear division between traditional and organic intellectuals. Gramsci's traditional intellectual, or the detached scholar of our time, is at least partially a fictitious construction. What Black Lives Matter movement has done, and what groups like EPE are striving to do, is to really drive home this point that this very clear black and white distinction between traditional intellectual and organic intellectual is a fictitious construction. A scholar working for a tenure in the ivory tower, or a writer hoping to make it to the bestseller charts, or a policy columnist hoping to be the next big policy wonk, is actually acting in ways that are consistent with power structures that undergird elite cultural institutions. As so many black in the ivory stories have poignantly shown, these institutions are guarded by hostile and often white gatekeepers in America and Brahminical gatekeepers in our own context here in India, that make them nearly impregnable for the historically marginalized. Right? So, I mean, the thing to understand is Gramsci's taxonomy is useful, except that most people don't get it, that Gramsci is trying to show that this distinction between traditional and organic intellectual is somewhat blurred, right? I mean, even your traditional intellectuals who the marginalized have to rely on to represent them actually work for their own class interests, right? Or their own caste interests. So these power structures are there, and these are real. The traditional intellectual in reality is also an organic intellectual, principally representing elite interests. A practical corollary of the detached scholar fiction is Gramsci's very prescient observation that the underclass is forced to rely on the leadership of the traditional intellectual. Right? I mean, when Gramsci came up with this taxonomy because he wanted to, I mean, he actually spends a couple of hundred pages showing how the underclass is really forced to rely on the leadership of the traditional intellectual. I mean, sticking on with the example that I started with, I mean, if you are a construction worker working outdoors in a heat wave, you don't have somebody that looks like you, shares your life trajectory at those policy tables, deciding what to do about those heat waves. You have to rely on the 7% minority sitting in an air-conditioned room like I am doing this talk to speak for you, right? And that's really the challenge that a group like EP is trying to confront. And good luck. I mean, this is a very, very hard problem, and I really can't thank EP enough for doing what it is doing. Thank you, and I'm hoping we can have a good conversation. I'll hand this back over to you, Arvind and Sunaina.
Thank you, Professor.